Hi, Dan. How are you? This is finally the one week when I don't have a meeting at 1 p.m. on a Friday.
Wow. Wow. Good. Good. Well, yeah, the agenda for today is basically, I think, to kind of talk about how things went. We didn't really talk that much throughout the last few weeks about kind of Obsidian and the process and the vault and kind of the shared experience and all of that. Although I'm happy to, if anyone has any final words, thoughts that they have had about the book itself too, then we can certainly take a couple of minutes to talk about that as well. So anybody want to kind of start us off? Are there any last thoughts about the book that we want to kind of talk about before we move on?
I think I found this YouTube series. I think it was Plessy. It might have been on your page from What is Politics on YouTube. That guy that was talking about the book. I don't know if anyone else watched this series, but I really enjoyed it, and I kind of feel like I left with more questions than answers. But I enjoyed it. Basically, I guess he's coming from a critique on the left and basically saying that David Graeber and Wengrow really didn't have a coherent argument in the end. There was a lot of good evidence there, but they really just didn't tie it together. They like went 90%, not 100. So that guy gave a good analysis. And now I also want to read what some other people have said about it, because basically his argument was like, people, me included, who didn't know anything about this stuff before, I think we definitely picked up the fact that the argument didn't totally come together at the end, but there were certain things that are omissions or things that I might not know just because I'm a popular audience for this thing. So I'm curious to hear what more experts think about it, basically.
Yeah, Plessy, I came across that because of your entries in the vault as well. I'm curious how you came across it and kind of what you thought about that video. I started to watch a little bit, but I didn't get too far into it.
I got into it because of because of YouTube's AI trying to push it to me. Mainly because of that, and I wrote that down because I wanted to speak of it in one of the meetings, but even what Maggie said, I couldn't reach that much of an understanding to write anything down. I just typed what I heard, and that's it.
Yeah, I think that's an interesting kind of challenge of this sort of transition from academic writing to popular writing, and it was one, I think kind of one that we sort of struggled with all the way through, right? The idea that when you compare, for example, the article about that article about the stupid savage, right? That they had co-authored together, that sort of became part of the argument of this. I think that there are certainly some differences in the way that they presented their evidence, in how broadly they kind of gave themselves permission to generalize and to kind of come to conclusions from it. It does seem like they much more in this wanted to do something bigger that would leave people thinking, like the title says, that they have what happened? That they've written a new history of humanity, but. Yeah, not. I think there were some,
and we'll come back to what is pod.
Sorry.
Oh, Stanley's listening to something on the computer and isn't muted, I think.
Oh, okay. Oh, you found the YouTube.
Yes, that's the beginning of the YouTube article, the video.
Oh,
yeah. I think that this, I mean, my kind of takeaway from this is that I think it was that this is really kind of just the beginning for me. I'm going to be spending a lot of time
of Graeber and Wengrow's new book, The Dawn of Everything. Today in this third installment of.
Okay, so Yeah, so you found I think I'll take a look at it too, because I haven't seen that one before, and I'm curious. But I do think that that the bibliography and the endnotes, I am going to kind of go back through all of these kind of discursive notes and see if they give me some additional light. I tried to do a little bit of that during the last few weeks, but I think it's going to take sort of going through sort of some of these ideas individually, and and spending some time and looking at some of the monographs behind them, and kind of sitting with each one of them for a while, and determine
the one thing I'm hearing too that probably seems like the root cause of a lot of the critique that I've heard is they didn't seem to have a specific audience in mind, or it's two primary academics who have written mostly academic work, although Graeber's written some popular material, but they're writing for a bigger, broader audience that doesn't have the background and context that they have. So they're trying to put that context out there and make a broader cultural appeal while they're also doing this heavy lifting academic work, which is great, but it's very hard to hit that mark between those two dramatically different endpoints. And I think at some point, Dan, you had mentioned that you kind of wish they had one or two epigraphs kind of written in between their original research targeted towards the academic community, and then they published this as a broader appeal. May have been the better way to go in the long run, but obviously, life is short and you have to do what you can do. So
right, yeah. Well, and I think also the book publishing industry is sort of in its own evolution, right? And has, and that adds a little bit to the challenge. And I'm thinking also of, a couple of years ago, I guess it is by now, Shoshana Zuboff's book on surveillance capitalism, right? Which is, I think she thought was important, and she wanted to sort of insert into, sort of what was going on in the public discourse about these issues. But it's a very difficult book. Right. And it's not a book that lends itself to a popular audience. And so I think that this is similar. And I suspect sort of that publishers don't entirely know, kind of where to go, with some of these, and what things, and then there's got to be, probably some additional difficulty when, one of your lead author has just passed away. Right.
Well, it's even tougher too, because it's at least in the US, and I think it may have been the original publishers, were Farrar, Straus, and Giroux, who are part of like the big five. And typically those are going to be, I don't know who the specific editor was, but I'm almost sure that this is not their bailiwick. This is not what they do day to day. Versus if you had gone to an academic publisher or a university press, you'd at least gotten an editor who has this as your space, So how do you rely on a good editor to make that jump from academia to what's really a popular press book? I mean,
right,
it's got coverage everywhere, and there are a lot of people, it's not the level of Hawking's physics tome, let's say, that is considered to be the biggest seller in the space of physics, but the least read and least understood book on the planet. So everybody buys it because this is a pretty book to have, and I should have it on my bookshelf. But I kind of want it, and I'm sure this is a bestseller. It's surely gone over 10,000 copies. It is in the second or third run by now. But I can't imagine, even 3/4 of the people who bought this book read it cover to cover, much less as in depth as even this group did. So
yeah.
So It's funny because I actually, by about chapter 9, I started wondering about what the editorial process had been. Like, it started to get the feeling like it hadn't been edited properly, or it hadn't been edited fully, or that it hadn't taken a whole lot of time. And actually, I had the same experience of Zubov's book, which is, I really enjoyed it, but it was unwieldy in terms of the kind of, and I don't think that's necessarily, although I appreciate what you're all saying about the kind of two audience thing, a scholarly or an academic audience and a more popular audience, and that if you're an editor, if you're not sitting between those worlds, it must be very hard to kind of integrate them or make it we have to make it whole for those two kinds of audiences. But yeah, I had a very strong feeling. I'd be so curious to hear from, like, it would be so interesting to hear from the editor about what that process is like, which you never tend to do. But yeah, it did start to feel pretty ragged, in the last 2 or 3 chapters in particular. But, imagine it with a really, really strong author, editor, they really might have been able to start to pull the thing together. And some of these kinds of open questions or frustratingly dangling questions would have been pruned or left, or sorted out.
Yeah. Well, and just the organization of the, chapter 1 and chapter 11 are going to be about the indigenous critique. Everything in the middle is going to be a different book.
I look behind me, and Francis Fukuyama's 2-volume set is also a Farrar Straus. And I don't know if it's a writing style of one person who's written for decades versus 2 people writing who haven't written together before is probably also kind of a quirky issue.
Yeah.
And I'm kind of curious too. I haven't seen anything anywhere. What do the next 4 volumes look like, and will they actually, continue on, and will those come out?
Right. Or is it just a series of emails where they were brainstorming some things? And yeah, it's kind of weird too, because you're also, I mean, I'm sure they wanted it to reach a lot of people, and, and I'm sure they wanted the book to sell a lot, and to get out there and to become, something that people discussed. And, and nowadays, I mean, I guess there are still some academic presses that, that might have been able to manage that, but it's got to be, a small handful. I mean, and I'm a tiny little fish, right? But my experience with Yale, with the Agrarian Studies series, is that they are just pretending that they're still in business. Right? There's nobody doing anything. There's nobody doing, editing. There's nobody really, shepherding these books along, giving any type of guidance, much less, than, kind of marketing and promoting and, and getting them out there into the world.
Yeah, I think that's the case for even the big publishers lately. There's, 1 or 2 hands on the wheel, and when it comes to publicity, nobody's putting any money into anything unless you've already got 3 bestsellers under your belt.
Mm-hmm. Which Graeber did.
So, and that's the thing. You put Graeber's name on this book, and it's just because of that, it's going to sell, even if he's not around to publicize it and promote it.
Right. So, so it will be interesting to see. I think that it probably will be, 6 months to a year before the dust settles and people kind of understand what we're taking, from this, and what we're going to sort of acknowledge that they have done with this intervention, right? I think it probably will result in a change in the way we look at, especially that prehistoric past, and maybe even that indigenous critique, because I'm certainly going to use, that, not necessarily presented as, kind of a done deal, conclusive thing, but the idea that it opens up this conversation again about the origins of things. Similarly, I had just run into, there was some talk about, I was just dealing with the Powhatans in Jamestown, in the Chesapeake Bay region, in my course this week, and there's some talk about this character who the Spaniards apparently called Don Luis. And a couple of scholars have done some research trying to figure out who this is. And this is a kid who was grabbed out of the Chesapeake Bay area, taken to Europe, came back, and then became a chief, possibly the big chief of the Powhatan Confederacy, and they're speculating, is he the father of the people who interact with the Jamestown people when they arrive? Or is he one of these chiefs? And so I think there's a lot of that. There's this big gap in history between the Spanish conquest and the English conquest. There's this century in between, and we don't really think that much about what happened then. So I think that indigenous critique thing is going to be an interesting way into that century, possibly. But anyway, the real purpose of today was kind of to talk about the book club experience and the Obsidian experience. And so, Maggie, I think that you probably have reflected on it more, at least in what I haven't in the last 24 hours or so, I haven't really kind of studied what everybody's put into the vault. But I noticed, Maggie, you had been sort of reflecting on it already. So do you want to kind of talk about that a little bit?
Yeah, I need to remember what I wrote. I think I wrote it like a week ago at this point.
Yeah, you're ahead of the game.
Let me see. Okay, yeah. So I guess one of the things that I can say that Dan and I have talked offline about a little bit is kind of like balancing the priorities of everyone in the book club in terms of teaching or learning specific techniques versus focusing on the book. And I guess from my experience, I have done a lot of book clubs. Like I've been involved in a Rome book club since the first one, so it's been over a year. And so I am pretty comfortable with note taking, even though I've mostly switched to doing a lot of that in Obsidian, which is very different. But so for me, I was really excited that we focused mostly on the book rather than on the note taking stuff. But I think that there can be a lot of value in kind of just observing what other people's note-taking skills are. So like I know Chris and Simon and Plessy, at least, I've read all of your notes, like not everything, but like I like being able to go through and like see other people's process. And I think that could be really generative, even if you don't say like, this is how I'm doing this. So it's kind of finding the right balance. So for me, I think that worked well. I think for someone who was like, I really want to learn Obsidian, they would have had to really actively try to see what other people are doing and maybe ask them questions. But for me, it worked.
Yeah, I also really enjoyed looking at Simon, what you're doing, Chris, Plessy, and also actually, I mean, Lewis and some other people did things in kind of different ways that that aren't the way that I usually work inside of Obsidian and when I'm taking my notes. So that was really interesting to kind of observe. And I think that will be valuable. My plan with the vault is kind of to leave it open for another week so that people can kind of tweak whatever, they want to, and then to move it over onto publish. So it'll just be kind of like a permanent record of this first.
I'm kind of curious if anybody had because we've been doing it almost long enough. And usually when you're doing this, at least in a Luhmann-esque way, it takes a while before you have enough notes that you like get to a point that you start seeing the bigger value of what's going on. So I'm curious if anybody, particularly who hasn't done this in their own space for a while, had some interesting aha moment or, oh, that's interesting, and I wouldn't have put that together because they saw something in the notes. If that makes sense, that kind of weird serendipity of these two things coming together that, from a combinatorics point, you may not have done yourself.
I guess one thing is that I noticed that Chris, we both came to some of the same connections between this book and Braiding Sweetgrass. And so like one of the things that I want to do is, I was thinking a lot about Braiding Sweetgrass, which talks about like indigenous ways of knowing and also a little bit about indigenous culture and how they encourage people to follow certain values. So I saw some stuff that you had written, and I was like, okay, I kind of had the same idea about Sky Woman and the creation myth. So that was pretty cool to see that we both kind of came to the same connection on that. I guess for me, I was focusing a lot on just like trying to figure out what the heck the book was saying. And I think that took a lot of my time. But I think, as Dan was saying, for me, I feel like this is the beginning. Now I have all these ideas about notes that I might want to write, or like things that I want to research further, like gender. I think, Nate, last time you sent a book to potentially read, the AK Press one. So I'm like, okay, like now I just want to gather all my thoughts and all my ideas that I've kind of had. And that's what I'm probably going to do once the vault is done, is just refactor everything that I wrote into my like new structure that I have in my own vault, and then see like where my launching off points are. Because I really tried to stay focused on just reading the text and not exploring too much else until after I finished the book, which is when I watched the reviews.
Yeah. I think that the braiding sweetgrass thing, and actually also, Chris, the other the idea of ancient sites as mnemonics was very interesting to me. I think that what I got though was more sort of that type of conversation, and not so much the thing I think that you were asking, which was, did the moment of magic happen where the whole is more than the sum of the parts? And I don't really feel like we got there. And I think that that's a problem that I have in my own vault as well, as I don't feel like I've gotten to this, the thing that Luhmann promises, the thing that Ahrens promises, right? The thing that Schmitz sort of says is real, that at some point it will become a conversation partner, right? And it will, the clusters will show you things that you hadn't been aware of. Right. And so I think that in this book club, because we were so focused, as Maggie says, on the book, there wasn't as much of an opportunity for that. And I don't think, and I think that for me, and that's why I'm sort of interested in reading the Ahrens book again more closely, and actually thinking about implementing the permanent notes part, the tail end of that process, where I really do try to do that to a much greater extent than I have, because I think that's where that moment of magic, if it happens at all, will happen, right? Where I have a lot of things that are densely connected, that are short fragments rather than big, book reviews like I tend to write. And so I think that is, so I think that is yet to happen for me. Nate, do you think it's been happening for you, Nate?
No, I mean, I'm, a baby when it comes to Obsidian. Someone, let me see who it was. Someone in their personal folder was talking about, like, benefiting from the crumbs falling on the table and sitting at like the table of geniuses. And I thought that was a beautiful sentiment, and that's definitely where I'm at as well. Now, I'm just curious, like, if the promise actually happens. That's what I'm curious about. Because I mean, so Simon, it seems like you use this extensively. Maggie, for sure. Chris, outside of this, it seems like y'all have been doing stuff with Obsidian for a long time. Are you finding that you get the serendipitous connections? And if so, when can we expect them?
No, I was actually thinking, just as we were just talking then, that I was so caught up in just keeping up with the book, really. And in fact, I think I did a poor job, in my own kind of opinion, of summarizing it, or even attempting to summarize it. It's really the stuff I've done is just really sort of pulling block quotes. But it did occur to me that, another strategy for something like this would be that you start with a single note per chapter, which is effectively a summary of the chapter. And so no one has to, let's say, worry about writing summaries. You say, let's say that's a given. And then everyone's role becomes kind of, let's say, grabbing and being in relationship to those individual notes. So here's something that's particularly about, let's say, the Indigenous critique, and it makes you think of this. And so you write a little note there which you hook to that particular chapter. So that we're all involved, we'd all become involved in that kind of being in relationship to the text together, as opposed to being in relationship to the text individually, which is certainly, that was my experience. And I think that's just because I was trying to keep up, as I say, but also because Obsidian, you know, if I've done similar things in Notion, and Notion's just so much better at collaborative kind of, even just being able to at people is such a big difference. But in terms of the serendipity thing, it's funny, isn't it? Because I've just actually finished and presented bizarrely a keynote in Hong Kong, which I had to do at 2 a.m. from here in London, and that was a very strange experience. But and so I was writing that in Obsidian, my vault, and certainly it, like, to me, that capacity to go, oh, there's that, and then to hook, oh, there's some, actually that Graeber idea, that Graeber and Wenger idea is super useful here, and right out of left field in terms of my specialty. But, you know, it seemed crazy not to think about, for example, the nature of cities and the way they described cities as existing for reasons purely by imagination, not because of the kind of rigid structures of cities. And so it was perfect in that sense. So yeah, I mean, I have no idea about when to expect it, but it's not that I've gone in expecting that, but I do feel like there's fluidity and flexibility. And that's partly why I name the notes the way I do, which is trying to go that there's something kind of active in the naming of the notes, which becomes quite useful to me. Anyway, yeah.
I've had one or two kind of serendipitous things. My problem, I think had we gone at about half the pace, I would have seen more, because we went through this pretty quickly, or at least in terms of the time and effort I was putting into the reading and making notes along the way. But I was also reading it pointedly with relationship to some other archaeology and anthropology stuff that I've read before. So in my own vault, there were 2 or 3 instances where things clicked together that I had read and made notes on before, but totally had forgotten, because some of them were kind of really deep, scholarly, crazy things that you read through a textbook and you'll absorb the broader themes, but you might not get the big points. And particularly because of a few category links or broad category links, and 1 or 2 were very specific, like, you know, super subtle ideas popped up. I think one of them, I actually moved another note I had from another book into this vault to kind of highlight that experience. Mm-hmm. And the 2 or 3 others required, a significantly larger chunk of notes, so I didn't bother, because they were all fairly tangential. But the other thing I find too that's interesting, and it's not Obsidian specific, but is a little more tailored to how I use hypothesis for annotating and writing notes. And I have a system that takes all my notes from there and dumps them into my Obsidian vault automatically. But in adding tags to things, I quite often find that when I start typing a tag, I'll get an autofill list that populates below the tag to say, here are some tags you might be interested in that are similar to, or that are kind of an autocomplete function. Mm-hmm. And quite often that autocomplete thing will spark quirky ideas, or I'll add additional categories to things that I never would have added without that autocomplete feature. So it's a whole different idea of memory because of that autocomplete function that I've not seen anyone talk about anywhere within this taking space. And in part, it's because very few of these tools, Obsidian, I think, kind of does a little bit of this with an autocomplete function. If you start a bracket, it'll try and think, hey, what could you be doing, and give you a list. But I haven't experienced that within Obsidian as many times as I have within Hypothesis as an autocomplete thing. So, but and I'm sitting on 7,000 plus notes in Hypothesis, so my experience there is going to be dramatically different than somebody who started using it even 2 months ago and opens it up 3 times a day.
So that's critical mass then.
Creeping through your Hypothesis has been a ton of fun, Chris. I played with it off and on. Just on that, like the autocomplete function. Well, so I saw in your stuff you've got that quote from Robin Sloan about doing work with the garage door open, and Dan also mentioned that too. So here, there's a really interesting conference that happens in Minneapolis when it's not pandemic times called IO. That's like, it's a lot of graphic design and computer stuff that I really do not understand, but also with like a lot of art overlap. So Robin Sloan did this talk in 2017 where he basically built a neural net to like help him write. And it has a lot of, it's a very different thing than what you were just talking about, Chris, but the way that he talks about the serendipity of prediction based on like a corpus of work was really interesting. If you've got 40 minutes to kill, I think that is time well spent.
Cool. Looks good. Thank you.
Well, and Maggie, I'm really curious, since you've put in so much time with Rome, do you find like, are there perks Rome versus Obsidian, like serendipity wise?
Rome, I think, is really good for thinking and not very good for reading or recalling. And that's one of the big reasons that I started using Obsidian more, was because Rome was kind of becoming a black hole for me. And although I do value, like, sometimes I need to work through a problem and it's really useful for that. But then after that, I want to be able to refer back to it later. And it's really hard to find things. It doesn't have a powerful search the same way Obsidian does, and it doesn't have folders. And so you have to be a very good data architect, or just accept the fact that you will lose many things in your graph. And I didn't really love that. So I think Obsidian is more powerful for like actually keeping your information and not losing it later. So I do still use Rome for some stuff, and I do like Rome for multiplayer, but I also was really impressed with, I feel like Obsidian worked much better as a shared vault than I expected it to, because basically the main thing that you can't do is write on the same page at the same time. But if that's not really what you're trying to do, like everyone has their sandbox, and then we have the glossary that we all contribute to. I thought that was really cool. And like, we haven't done a glossary type thing in past Rome book clubs, although the books we've read haven't necessarily been books that have lent themselves to it as well as this one did. But I thought the glossary thing was really cool. I tried to contribute some stuff. I loved being able to see what other people had. And I think Obsidian handled that really well. And also now I can take some of those things from the glossary and I can put them in my own vault. Like, I might not take everything, but I found like, I feel like that's pretty useful.
Yeah. I have been at first, when I first started using the shared vault for my classes, I thought, and I was actually like asking my students discussion questions at the end of each section of a chapter. And so there were a lot more opportunities for, sort of conflicted copies. But even then it wasn't sort of insurmountable. And I think that probably, I've been sort of thinking about it because George asked me a question about it, and so I made a little video yesterday. I don't think that, I mean, I think that it's cool technology to be able to do, like a Google Doc or a Teams, document, where everybody's sort of editing it simultaneously, but what's the goal, and does that really, I guess you could build an activity where it would be the goal and where it would be, where it would be valuable, and it would be, it would sort of add to the process. But I don't think that's exactly what we were doing. And I do think that it was more, because I think our goal was to have people, sort of not brainstorming, but kind of coming up with sort of considered responses that, even the couple of times where we ran into the situation, like while, in a group setting like this, where we're on Zoom together and a couple of people are looking at the vault, I think that happened once or twice, where we noticed that there were a couple of people in a document that was easy enough for somebody to back out and say, okay, I'll come back to that.
I've had one or two experiences in groups, not too dissimilar from this. And there's a few people I've noticed who are kind of working at some of these problems. One group uses it's a 24-hour-a-day chat. And then they take the most interesting things that happen in the chat or the best ideas, and then those get moved to a media wiki installation. And they've even built an integration so that while you're in that chat, there's a bot that you can talk to. And if you use a few bits of syntax, the bot will actually add what you want to the wiki as you go. So you're not duplicating your effort, having to go cut and paste back again. There's another one, and it might be an interesting experiment to try because it works with Obsidian, but there's a developer, I want to say he's in the Netherlands, who is working on a project called anagora.org. So it's an agora as in a marketplace of ideas. But he is taking people who are building and or maintaining public knowledge bases. So it'd be like your own personal Wikipedia, but he's aggregating them together from multiple platforms. So I think he's got integration so that regardless of whether you're using Obsidian or Foam or Roam, or I think he's even got one for WordPress, so that you can contribute to a broader knowledge base and interact. And on each of the pages, he's actually got there's a little sub-stub at the bottom that is actually an active link to an instance of Etherpad, which essentially is a real-time collaborative tool, much like Obsidian is, and you can use the same vocabulary. So let's say we were all on this call together taking notes. We could do it in an Etherpad with the same syntax we would all use in Obsidian. It doesn't cause conflicts and issues. And then when you're done, everybody can take a copy and dump it wherever they want to put it. But his is interesting in that you can write and create your own thing, but then you can look up that topic and all the wiki links that everyone else in this group, and there's probably 30 or more, I think at this point, that are in there, and see what they thought on that topic or different topics. And it's a fascinating little ecosystem, but you can, I think for Obsidian, the easiest way would be to dump all your data into a GitHub and then tell him, here's my GitHub repository. And then he syncs it in real time to his bigger, massive super wiki, if you want to call it that. It's super technical and the UI is not the prettiest thing on the planet. But once you know what's going on and what's happening there, it becomes much, much more useful. And hopefully over time, the design will kind of pick up, but it's it's a different way of multi-collaboration than the more direct one, the centralized one we've been using.
It's interesting, isn't it? Because one of the things that struck me at the beginning of this experience was I just got so overwhelmed so quickly by the vault and the kind of explosion that happened at the beginning. And I mean, easy to say in hindsight, but he was a little bit like, let's just take a breath for a couple of weeks. But yeah, I found myself going, my sort of response to that was to go, like, how do I even begin to be in with it? And so it's interesting, Chris, just to hear you talking about the kinds of structures they have in place for that system, and the extent to which how much structure is necessary or needed or wanted. Very, very tricky given different personalities and different histories and experiences.
I think for me, that was probably the toughest part, was facing this mountain of a book at a heavy pace and being able to not only just read the book, but then actually spend some time in the vault with other people's ideas. Was, like reading twice the pace that I thought I was going to end up needing to read at.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I was just kind of looking at the graph and just sort of clicking on things, and I just sort of clicked on your page on context collapse in anthropology, and sort of Chris, and sort of the way that you structured that, and the links, and the and kind of that. Did you find that to be kind of a useful process?
It's mostly for me in my personal graph and how those links work together. And there's still some programming pieces I want to build in to add additional value to some of those subcategories in terms of how I link and what level things are at. So, I may have a wiki link for a broad topic like anthropology, but then how can you kind of subcategorize things within anthropology to help make finding and linking other things more useful? And in part, some of it's kind of a little more to the library and information science space, which I have at least some passing experience with. Mm-hmm. But having read a lot of history of rhetoric and notebooks and commonplaces, through 2,000 plus years of history, it's, how do you do these things? And even oral cultures have methods, of doing what we're doing, but without writing it down. Mm-hmm. Difference was they memorized it and then used their memories as they were walking through their natural environment. So right. When they see a door, they don't just see the door, but they see all the memories they've attached to that door that then create kind of a different combinatorial space of how do you link one idea to another and what comes of that. Mm-hmm. And I think it's hard because most of it's not written in English, but there was Raymond Yull in the 11th and 12th century wrote a lot about this stuff from a Western mnemonic tradition and how to combinatorially, we can take notes on index cards and then rearrange the index cards or juxtapose them to compare two ideas on index cards. But, 4 centuries before the index card existed, he was doing this mentally in his mind. And, it's super painful stuff to read in translation, much less to read even in the original. But essentially, that's what he was doing. And, there are very few people who read or study about this kind of sub area of, history 800 years ago, mm-hmm. in part because it's, it's super dense. And even if you know what he's doing and you have a concept of what he's doing, it's still hard to read. But you could create a little plugin in Obsidian that takes I think there are plugins for random notes.
Mhm.
You can say, oh, give me a random note.
Yeah.
But I think what's more interesting is give me 4 random notes out of my vault, and how can I think about and create a shared context for those 4? Are they linkable or not linkable?
Oh, there's an app there's a plugin for that too that shows you the walk from point A to point B.
Yeah. Or God, I saw a couple weeks back, Ward Cunningham has a wiki product called FedWiki that is essentially a shared or federated wiki. So you have your own personal install, but you're part of a broader, Wikipedia experience, if you want to put it that way, where your knowledge can collide with others. Or if, let's say, Dan, you write a note and I think it's interesting in your public space, I can literally make a one-click, super dead easy copy of your note and put it into my index, and then either change it or supplement it or connect it to something else. But he showed a bot that went through and followed all of the links from one card to the next to kind of show how, and probably the best example I can give, there are some textbooks where there'll be 40 chapters, and the author of the textbook knows you're never going to cover the whole thing in a semester or a year. So they may say, I suggest you cover chapters 2 and 3, 5 and 7, and then jump to chapter 40.
Mhm.
And that could be a semester.
Mhm.
But there are infinite number of ways you could jump through a textbook of material and have a kind of coherent through line. And so he had a little bot that showed it's essentially a random walk through someone's card index. But in his case, it was, what do all the random walks look like in a way that you could study it and have it make sense from, let's say, an academic perspective. So if you're a first grader, you're going to have to walk through 3 or 4 cards of context before you can understand card 5.
Mhm.
But how do you, if you want to study what's on card 5, what's the shortest path through your space to learn and figure out what card 5 is about?
Mhm.
And it was a fascinating little thing. But within kind of the broader Rome research, Obsidian kind of craze, there are not a lot of people who are doing that level of work or who even know what's going on,
Mhm.
because they're not aware that people have been working on this for 3 decades.
Mhm.
And it's almost like this is a new area of thinking and research in space since the pandemic almost.
Right. Well, where part of it is actually in the Memex demo, right?
Yeah.
And from the 60s or whatever that was. Yeah, and I think that Tinderbox / Story Space, we're kind of also thinking about sort of that, maybe not a completely random walk, but a path, different paths through the woods that would connect some of these things together. And I think Jeremy Dean is thinking about that at in the context of hypothesis too.
Yeah. Have you read Mark's essay or seen his it's not really an essay, it's a set of web pages essentially about the digital garden? It's an early website from 1998. And essentially he talks about the web as being a curated garden or a walled garden. So you can go in and you don't necessarily have to take a particular path through a garden to appreciate it. You can come in from different directions and take different paths through it. And then in like 2015, Mike Caulfield wrote an essay. I think he gave it as a keynote speech somewhere, but it turned it into an essay called, essentially it's kind of a foundational piece of this digital garden space now, but it's you have your own personal wiki or kind of digital knowledge space, and then you have streams of information, whether it's coming from social media or, you know, Twitter is probably a good example of a stream of data that is totally unorganized. And you can take little bits of things that float through your stream and then take them and plant them into your garden and curate them and either grow them or maybe they die over time. Who knows? But it's an interesting way of kind of framing what we're doing and how we're doing it. I'll pull a link up for you.
Yeah, I see there's a Maggie Appleton wrote a thing about.
Oh yeah, she's got a big piece that's got links to all of, or at least most of it, I think.
Yep. I got that here. Oops.
May I ask you a question, Chris? I'm looking at your hypothesis one, and I noticed the annotations. Do you have some master list of all the tags that you're using? Do you remember all those tags you're using?
Fortunately, there's a limit to what the local storage will hold, I think, and somewhere around 1,500. So it'll hold about 1,500 tags. And if I recall, I think Luhmann over his lifetime with 90,000 cards had somewhere around the range of 3,200 kind of tags or categories. So Hypothesis does a pretty decent setup. The key is to use the same browser, so you have the same browser cache. Although I know how to cheat, and occasionally I'll go in and remove misspellings or fix spellings, and then I have a master list of things in my vault that are the 500 most popular things that I tend to tag stuff with. And I know how to go into the browser and erase what's there and replace it if I need to, or make it match across multiple browsers, which is not always the easiest thing. But it usually is pretty helpful.
It looks like your top 50 that I'm looking at right now, you've got from 1,100 to about 51 tagged items. So that seems to be kind of an exponential curve, right? So the other, 51 to 500 probably are interesting, but not as.
There is a long tail on my. So I've got a personal website that I've been using this way for, I don't know, 7 or 8 years now. And it has a taxonomy that's over 7,000 items. And, the top 15 or 20 each go into the several hundreds, I think.
Mm-hmm.
But then there's a huge long tail of a lot of singletons or things that I really need to alias. So, you may have, in my case, usually I tend to go with plural tags for things that I'm talking about that are broadly public. And I'll use a singleton tag to indicate things specific to me. So when I tag something with commonplace books, it's commonplace books is a public broad idea. And if I tag it with commonplace book singular, it's my particular instantiation of what that thing is or how it's working, which makes it a little easier for me to find. But
yeah. And do you do pretty much all of this hypothesis work with the garage door open, or do you have a private?
Probably about 90%. I do have a private hypothesis group that's only me. And there are some things that go into that are either weird or not appropriate for public consumption, or that are just so specific to me, nobody else really would care.
Yeah.
Like little reminders or things to do kind of stuff that like just are not. but even then I tend to tag those things to make sure that I can easily export them if I need to in a weird way. So,
Oh, sure. Yeah. Yeah. Actually, I hadn't thought of that. I could use the tags to, because I have a private group that I call research too, that yeah, but I could use the tags actually to remind myself.
I have a couple ways of exporting data from there to multiple places. So
Mhm.
quite often, the UI I like is as simple and easy. You highlight something and you just start writing.
Mhm. Yeah.
Chris, I'm really curious, like, well, how much time do you spend like reading, processing, all that kind of stuff? And then how does this connect with the rest of your life? Like, what do you do with all of this?
There's some
Dan,
stuff
Dan, if this is too tangential, feel free to.
No, that I'm interested too.
Well, that's the interesting part about some of this is how do there aren't as many people writing about how they do this stuff, or if they do, the most of the stuff I find, somebody will write an article about, oh, I discovered this Zettelkasten idea yesterday and here's how it works, but they barely touch the surface and there's nothing new and interesting. So the more interesting people to read are Stephen, the writer, nonfiction writer Stephen Johnson, I think in the New York Times in 2006 wrote an essay about how he used, I want to say it was Scrivener at the time, to like do his research and how these connections. And so to me, that's one of the earliest English language versions of a Zettelkasten before it became popularized after 2013. And even then it really didn't hit the road until 2017, I think, with Sanka's book. But nobody was writing about their process and how they do these things, whether they're productive or not. But then you also almost have to, I think in Stephen Johnson's case, I don't think he did any research. He just like, here's a tool, and he had used it for so long that he discovered these things coming out of it that made his writing easier.
Oh, I forgot, Maggie. Thanks. Yeah, I forgot that he had written about Dawn of Everything. I read that review. Yeah, it's kind of weird because there was the period of time when the whole I mean, I remember the first time I ran into it, it was like Beck Tench talking about it, and I had no idea what the heck. I mean, and it was in this really, really kind of complicated tinderbox forum thing that was just not helpful to me at all.
Well, I've been digging back, and the earliest version I can find of it in German, essentially with the German word, is the mid 14th century, and it's a guy who essentially invented what is now the modern encyclopedia, but a German researcher and librarian by the name of Konrad Gessner.
Oh, right, sure.
He writes a 4-point note about what a Zettelkasten is and how it works, or suggests how it could work or should work. And there's various instances of them into the early 20th century. So there are even comedians in particular. Phyllis Diller had an index card system of several 100,000 cards that she just had jokes written on.
Oh, that's cool.
Bob Hope had one that he kept on written sheets of paper in filing cabinets. And it wasn't organized incredibly well, and I think he just used it based on memory, but Ronald Reagan kept index cards in binders with sheets and kept quotes. So essentially it was an older commonplace book, and he would pull quotes out and say, here, Peggy Noonan, go put this into my speech.
Right.
But he had to rely mostly on memory of which quotes were where within his system to be able to use it that way, which I think I threw a note here into our group. Eminem has a an old school commonplace book.
Right.
And, my favorite is he's got the best description of it. He calls it stacking ammo.
Yeah.
Which is so much more creative and clever than, index card catalog box.
Yeah.
Which essentially was what Zettelkasten really means. I mean, the problem is we've forgotten how we all did this 40 or 50 or 100 years ago, when we're reinventing the wheel every time.
Yeah, I do like how Costin suggests, a trunk of treasure, but
well, it's similar to, the Latin word thesaurus essentially means storehouse or treasure box. But nobody talks about that anymore. And you just think of it as a dull book that sits on your shelf that you may pull down twice a year to look up. In fact, you don't even pull the book out anymore. You just Google the word with synonym or antonym.
Right. Yep. Yep.
So
Well,
let me just throw this out there. Part of, so I know at least a few people here are teachers, and then maybe other folks have been teachers previously. I feel like I work with a very different student population than, I don't know, some of the other folks that do teaching work here, where I am always and in the school I have a unique position because I teach like freshman composition classes, which is like one of the few classes that every single student has to take unless they somehow dodge the requirement. And one of the things that I'm always trying to get students to do is like think more long term about like what it is that they're learning in their different classes, which I have not had a ton of success with, because like students look, at least the students that I often work with, they look at their general education requirements as just like this burden that they want to race through as soon as they possibly can, so they can like forget everything that they just spent like 16 weeks working on. And so one of the things that I'm really interested in is like, how do we encourage some of these habits of mind, taking good notes, reflecting on these notes with, younger folks.
I think Aaron's, as I've been sort of returning to the Aaron's book, I think he had some interesting things to say that were sort of adjacent to retrieval practice, that I'm paying more attention to this time around.
I remember so I'm almost 50, but I remember in 6th grade, we had to write an essay or a little like mini term paper. And it was, maybe a 4-page thing. And this was at a time when everybody in my class, we all wrote them by hand in cursive, but I was one of the few kids who had a typewriter or a word processor to be able to like turn it in separately without handwriting. But our teacher made us like, you got to use 4 sources. Only one of them can be an encyclopedia business. I'm sure not a lot of that has changed. And they said, take notes and write stuff on index cards. But that was it. That was like the depth of the instruction on what you should use an index card for. Like, take notes and put it on an index card, and then you can reshuffle your index cards, and then from that you can write the paper, which is fine, and that kind of works. But that is a dramatically different framing than if you go back and you read, Erasmus in the 1400s, or Philip Melanchthon, who wrote out in heavy, gory, full detail why one should keep a commonplace book, what it was, what the benefits were, what its uses were in education. And other than Sanka Aaron's, I don't think you can find that, because it's gotten so lost in modern education that it has become watered down over time. And even the idea of the Zettelkasten in America, at least, because most of the good stuff is all written in German. and there is a solid through line from the 1400s to the, exhibition at Marbach in 2013, how to do this, what you're doing it for, and why. And it was passed from scholar to scholar, maybe. And there's maybe one book in 1921, I think, in English that kind of touches on some of it, but doesn't get into the heavy depth that Aaron's does. And I think most of the academics in the US who use these systems read or had someone give them that book from 1921 that touches on some of it, but loses parts of it. So it's what gets passed down from the generation before you, is it, you obviously have to summarize some of it so that you can move on to other newer things. But I think it's been summarized to death that we've forgotten how to do what we're doing. So, I definitely feel for you, but I was that kid in 6th grade who I hated this stuff. But fortunately, I was blessed with a massively much better memory than any of the 20 of my peers combined. So I could read stuff and remember it, having seen it once. So my teacher was irked that I took 0 notes. I mean, I failed the note-taking part of the assignment. But, lo and behold, I wrote an essay and blew everyone away and won the regional and then the state, whatever this competition was. I won the state level for this essay contest. And, they were all scratching their heads. How did you took no notes? And I'm like, well, I read twice as much as any of the other kids did, I'm sure too, but
Nate, I'll tell you that, I'm at the other end of the spectrum. Other end of the college spectrum. I'm a graduate dean. And so I always worry about what we provide to help graduate students write their theses and dissertations, because having them sit down and write a 200-300 page, dissertation from scratch is an onerous task. And so even before any of these tools, Rome or Obsidian or Aaron's book came out, we always ran writing workshops. And, the one thing that we always had was part of the program was a session called Writing with Slides. And we had them use PowerPoint slides, blank, no art, no media, nothing, only text boxes. So it was, it was kind of like, just writing a blank page or a blank note. And so they would write down a fleeting note on what they were reading. And, they would do this for each paper or part of a paper, and they would collect these things. And then, if you looked at PowerPoint notes in layout view, so you could see them all at once, then you could rearrange them and you could put them in logical order, and then you could, tell the story. So it's a little bit like Scrivener. And then as the modern tools evolve, then we had Rome or Remnote or Obsidian or any of the anything else that's come along. But yeah, for many years it was just what was very effective was just writing with slides, and that meant blank PowerPoint slides in slide layout format. And, you can only get it, if you do it right, you can only get about 4 to 6 lines of text
Right.
at a reasonable size font
Mhm.
on a PowerPoint slide. So you can't say very much, but that's good because
Paraphrasing, it's summarizing, and it's
yeah, exactly. Very effective.
yeah. I think I'm trying to focus on that with my students in a historical methods class right now too, where I'm trying to to kind of talk them through this process, because we've spent a lot of time with the writing part of it. We've got writing handbooks at the wazoo, right? But this part at the front end of how what's this magical process where somebody else's knowledge becomes your knowledge, right? And that's been sort of focusing my attention lately.
Well, I kind of like the way Samka Ahrens kind of frames it from, if you're taking interesting notes of your thoughts of things as you go along, and then when somebody says, okay, now you got to write a term paper of 10 pages on this thing, if you've been reading all along and taking notes, then it's pretty easy to look at your note space and say, these are the areas I'm interested in, because here's where all my tags are.
Mhm.
I can look at my categories and say, okay, there's 7,000 of them, but when 20 of them have all the links, okay, those are the 20 I can focus on, and then I can pull an idea out of that and make something.
Mhm.
But the problem is knowing that doing the work up front slowly, a bit at a time, it's the tortoise and the hare idea, I guess. The slow and steady wins the race. Whereas you'll have a lot of students who don't know that, don't understand it, don't get it, or have never been taught that. And then suddenly you got to write a paper, and then they think, okay, this week I need to read 3 books and try and figure out some idea to write about. But then the idea they're writing about is just regurgitating stuff they've read, rather than how can you take the stuff you've read and come up with a new or interesting idea. And so reading this particular book, The Dawn of Everything, for me is interesting because it ties together 5 things I've already been reading about.
Mhm.
And provides, so I can immediately see a big thesis for a book I can write that ties these ideas all together. But then I've now got 3,000 cards worth of information in detail I can fill that book up with.
Mhm.
So I don't have to write the book so much as I just have to edit it into being, and then, but that's another piece too, that you don't see or hear any. Ahrens kind of touches on it, but
Totally,
nobody really talks about that. I wish I could take, do a search through my Obsidian vault and print out on index card size things, 2,000 or 3,000 cards, and then be able to sit and shuffle them physically and then go from there.
Mhm.
Usually I do a quick search and then pull all the things out of the search into a document and trim down from there.
Mhm.
To write pieces. But I probably have 3 books worth of material. I just need to actually sit down and edit the 3 books. And my problem, as Nate mentioned before, is where do you find the time? It's tough to find time to read all this stuff to begin with, much less to actually do something with it after the fact. So
Mhm. Yeah, one of the challenges that I've had is I did a bunch of research about, I don't know, 15 years ago now, and I would like to do something with it, but it's not in that it's I actually have to now go through the process of putting it into something like a vault so that I can actually see the connections and kind of make that that walk through it. And that's where, I'm hoping that, that now having discovered these things, as I'm collecting this, this information, it will be an easier kind of a process. God, we have, this is a chat that I am going to have to post, because there's a lot of good stuff in here. Thanks everybody for the comments and the links and everything. This is going to be fun to kind of dig into.
Curious if anybody else has tried taking what they've annotated or noted and turned it into, I do short articles and blog posts, every now and then out of some of my stuff, but it's usually things that I'm like, okay, I'm sick and tired of everybody, at some point I got tired of everybody saying Luhmann invented the Zettelkasten, and I'm like, okay, we gotta write something about that, because we just need to put a stop to this. But
yeah, well, Schmidt waved at it on the way by in his 2016 article, I think. Although I wasn't that interested in, honestly, in the I think what he did like Leibniz and talked about some other people, in Germany. I have had so many websites and blogs over the years that that no longer exist, that I can maybe, some of them I can find in the Wayback Machine, but yeah, it ought to actually, Chris, as you were sort of talking about the anagora.org, I was, and how all of these things can be linked together, I was thinking, holy crap. I mean, all of the information that will be linked, how much of it will be just chaff, and how much of it will be the stuff that I'll actually want to hang on to. And I think that's there's got to be, along with all of these ways of getting this information out there and connecting it, there's got to be, a way of sifting it as well, and sort of selecting and kind of promoting the things that are at least at this moment, kind of the ones that we want to pursue and stuff. But that's just
Yeah, it's a little bit like there's just not enough friction, isn't it? It's just that's digital kind of tools in general. There's not enough friction, and so in a way, kind of for me, that sort of says, well, how does this thing earn its place in this archive? And it needs to do some work to get in there, and I need to do some work with it. And so I think, in a way, for me, there's just something about the slowness of that, and not feeling like and that's partly why the graph is so seductive for people, because people want to see big kind of graphs. But so I'm kind of curious about just like, well, if this is a garden and it needs constant tending, then if I'm just constantly adding new plants, then it just gets, the sort of, the metaphor's a bit, but it gets overgrown. And so yeah, so there's just something about how do I introduce friction, even if it's cognitive friction, meaning in terms of how I'm thinking about it, which I think is kind of useful. This has gone way off from what we were talking about, but yeah.
But I think it goes back to what Stan was talking about the the PowerPoint, the atomic note, or if you want to call it that, or whatever, or what I'm thinking of actually about the permanent note, about actually moving my process from, because although, I don't put any type of big media in my vault, right? So my files, it's just markdown, right? So it's still, the file size is small. So I can dump, I can let Readwise scoop. And for the longest time, I resisted that, right? Letting anything automated happen in my vault, right? And now it's sort of like, okay, Readwise seduced me, and now I let it scoop all of that stuff in there. But that's just, there needs to be some, I think friction is a good word, Simon. There needs to be a filter there that it has to go through to become meaningful, right? And I tried like saying, okay, now I'm going to create a permanent note, and I'm going to number it in the way, and I'm going to do this. I'm going to do some type of ritual that would make it significant, right? And I haven't really kind of landed on a firm kind of final recipe for that. But I think that that's the thing that's preventing me. And that's why I want to do the Sunk Aaron's thing next again and relook at that. Is I need to create a way for myself to get to, to have a bunch of those things so that then the serendipity can happen and the connections, can be more visible to me.
So one of the things that I noticed too, Dan, you did a good video recently talking about connecting items within your graph, and you used the metaphor of the Kuiper belt of all these asteroids floating around, and how do you bring them within the planetary sphere and make them these small asteroids and turn them into planets. And so that's an interesting framing.
Yeah, I think I was watching The Expanse, and but I do think that I do need that those things that are just kind of out there, I need to, and it's, and gardening is the other metaphor, right? I do need to kind of pretend that garden and re-look at those things and not just be moving shoving stuff in so fast that I never go back and understand it and understand how it connects and stuff.
There's two pieces to that. So part of it is the idea of either you're working for your notebook or your notebook is working for you. And it's one of the reasons I like hypothesis so much, is I can, while I'm sitting and reading and I'm in a context, I can write down an idea, and I tend to either write solid, good summaries of the thing I've read or the idea I've seen. And I may take a break in reading and write for a half an hour into one little annotation and write a mini essay in and of itself. And all that stuff goes into my notebook. And so I'll have, I have thousands of orphan notes that, really don't connect to anything except with, tags or kind of category keywords that I might use. So it's what future context will I want to run into this thing again? And how do I tag it to help force that to happen? So I don't mind having that Kuiper belt of thousands of things outside, because I spend more time in work. So something like this book, I'm going to spend more time going over the notes and refining them and better connecting the ideas to other books I've read than most of the rest of the stuff I may read this year.
Sure.
But the extra work I put in after I've taken the initial note tends to be on the handful of topics or categories that I really love and I'm going to do something with.
Yeah.
And those things being highly connected creates way more value so then I don't worry about those other thousands that, Readwise or something might pull in, because I know if they've got some tags in them or they're searchable, when I go to create that thing, most of the stuff is already going to be there and I can create an outline and pull that material in. But while I'm doing that process, I may come across 36 unconnected notes that are floating out in that Kuiper belt that will become useful and interesting, and I'll connect them at that point.
Yeah.
And that becomes a means of, hey, I'm really interested in this area, versus I was interested enough when I read it, but I don't care that much about it that I'm going to do all the extra work now, because it doesn't add to the enterprise. And figuring that balance out takes you a while.
Yeah.
And if it helps, you can I think there's a few people who have written about the collector's fallacy.
Right.
Collect everything. But if you've got it in one central place like Obsidian, then that's the problem too, is I've got paper notebooks. I've got a 10-year-old plus blog with 40,000 posts on it. And I've now got this massive Obsidian vault. Or you have Twitter or 57 other places. The bigger problem is I know this thing. Where the hell do I find it? And having it all in one centralized place, is 90% of the work. That's the secret, really, is, how do you keep it in one place
that you have a chance of finding that thing you know,
Mhm.
or that is going to surprise you when you find it because it's linked to something else.
Right. Yeah, I think there is filtering and pruning involved in there, but yeah, you're probably right. There's a value to having some things there out in the belt that that can, fall to earth when the time comes.
I mean, I don't think in all the stuff I've read, or even translations from German, people talking about Luhmann's examples, usually the most popular.
Mhm.
But and people will talk about the value of links, but one of the most valuable things, and it's the hidden work that you don't see and you don't acknowledge, but the way he kept his paper version, he was forced to put a number and stick it into the system somewhere as the first act. So you write the note, but then you got to put it in somewhere. And because of the way he put it in, everything had at least one link,
Right.
if not a link to the reference where it came from, or a category keyword link to his, taxonomy.
No, I think you're right. And I think we underestimate, and I think Aaron's, even the way when he describes it, underestimates the effort and the time that was involved in that process.
Yeah. So as you're taking your notes and you can think of something else that relates to it, that's awesome.
Mhm.
But if the only thing you can do is put the keyword anthropology on it, that's okay. It's not as great because anthropology is such a huge area.
Right.
But how do you create, and once you start into an area like anthropology, you eventually come up with words like comparative anthropology, sociology, and other things that branch off of that. And the more specific you can get, the better you are if you can't connect it particularly to another specific idea. And because you can then do a search and see all those and then play around within that search query to create some more links.
Yeah.
But it's that nobody's talking about that in that work. And it's very rare that, Sanka kind of touches on it a little, but I don't think he does as much highlighting of that. And a lot of the digital versions make it so easy to write a note and put it into a system, but you're not forced to create a link to that one other idea that really is part of what makes the system super valuable. So the digital versions are kind of hindered in that UI perspective. If you have to file it somewhere, where are you going to file it so that you run across it again?
Yeah.
Nick Milo kind of talks about this. He calls it the mental squeeze point. So I found that kind of helpful. He's basically like, there's this point where either you get completely overwhelmed or you do something to sort out the complexity. And he uses like maps of content, which is basically like structure notes to do this. But I found that concept really helpful because when I noticed that feeling, I'm like, I can't figure out what the heck is going on. It's like, okay, I can like take a step and I can organize, and it helps me figure out. I don't actually have to worry about being so organized when I first start a project, but then once I'm starting collecting lots of notes, then I start categorizing them or organizing them or something to help make sense of it.
Yeah, I think that's helpful, Meg, and thanks for mentioning that. I'll check Nick's ideas about that. I think there is a kind of a process of ping-ponging back and forth from collecting to organizing, pruning to collecting to, I just made my first maps of content for my personal vault like 2 weeks ago. So, and they're completely arbitrary and random, based on what I found in there and incomplete, but, at least they're kind of a start. So, I want to be kind of conscious of time. We have used it. Do we want to continue for another 5 minutes, or do we want to kind of, this seems like an interesting conversation, but it's also an interesting kind of segue to the next thing. And it is wine o'clock. It's actually lunch o'clock for me. And then I've got to eat quick, and I have a class at 2. So any last word? Anybody want to have the last word?
Thank you, Dan.
Yes, thank you.
Yes, thank you. Thank you.
Thanks, Dan.
This has been a great experience.
Well, thanks. I hope that this is not the end. Like I said, I will. I think this was a great conversation. I'm looking forward to posting this and having other people able to see it as well, because I think we covered a lot of interesting ideas. And I will definitely post the chat because there's a lot of great links in there too. So thanks everybody for that. And there are a lot of things that I'll be kind of returning to and kind of checking out. So thanks. And yeah, and I hope we do this again. So
Yeah, thanks a
Take
lot,
care.
everybody.
Bye.
It's been a blast.
Have a good weekend.
have a great
Okay.
afternoon. See ya.